The heavy iron hinges of the Porta Salaria shrieked across the humid midnight air, an unnatural sound soon swallowed by the suffocating scent of burning timber drifting from the Imperial gardens. For exactly 800 years, no foreign power had successfully breached the walls of the Eternal City. Since the Gallic invasion of 390 BCE, the capital of the known world had stood as an untouchable fortress. But on August 24th, 410 CE, the heart of the Roman Empire did not fall to a massive siege engine, a brilliant tactical assault, or the overwhelming weight of an enemy force. It fell because someone on the inside simply walked to the gates and unlocked the door. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we dissect the sack of Rome, the 3 days of terror that shattered the myth of an immortal empire. By the dawn of the 5th century, the Roman Empire was a fractured behemoth. The vast administrative apparatus had permanently split into East and West, a divorce that left the western half perpetually starved of resources and struggling to defend its frontiers. While the Senate continued to convene in the ancient capital, real political power had retreated north. Emperor Honorius, a ruler paralyzed by paranoia and incompetence, relocated his imperial government to Ravenna. The new capital was effectively an island, insulated by miles of stagnant marshes. The heavy scent of rotting reeds and deep-sucking mud provided a natural defensive barrier, granting the emperor an illusion of absolute security. Yet, while the court at Ravenna hid behind this impenetrable bog, the rest of Italy, including Rome, was left completely exposed to the shifting tactical pressure of the continent. The structural decay of the Western military was the empire's most fatal vulnerability. The regular army, the vaunted legions that had once conquered the Mediterranean world, was a hollowed-out shell. To maintain the porous Rhine and Danube frontiers, the imperial government entirely outsourced its defense. Entire Germanic tribal confederations were hired as federati. Allied troops contracted to fight under Roman banners. These men were not undisciplined raiders. They were highly organized, battle-hardened veterans. They wore Roman chainmail, marched in precise cohort formations, and executed complex tactical maneuvers. Among the most powerful of these groups were the Visigoths. This reliance created a highly volatile paradox. The survival of the West depended entirely on Gothic military muscle. Yet the Senate and the imperial court systematically marginalized these soldiers. They were consistently denied agricultural land to settle their families, cheated of promised wages, and blocked from political legitimacy. The frontier encampments reeked of oiled leather, sweat, and wood smoke, echoing with the frustration of tens of thousands of armed men treated as disposable assets. They were led by Alaric, a brilliant commander who had fought for Rome and understood its logistics as intimately as any general born on the Palatine Hill. The tension between a cowardly government, isolated in the swamps, and a massive unpaid allied army was a powder keg. Honorius possessed neither the gold to appease these veterans, nor the legions to defeat them. But the true catalyst for Rome's destruction wasn't an external invasion. It was a catastrophic, self-inflicted wound signed by the imperial court itself. In August 408 CE, the fragile geopolitical equilibrium holding the Italian peninsula together violently snapped. The imperial court orchestrated the execution of Flavius Stilicho, the supreme military commander, and the singular figure possessing the strategic acumen to manage the complex Gothic alliances. Stilicho, a patrician of half-Vandal descent, served as the indispensable bridge between the traditional Roman state and the Germanic field armies it desperately relied upon. His decapitation was far more than a routine political assassination. It represented the systematic dismantling of the Western Empire's entire defensive architecture. with Stilicho removed. An aggressively xenophobic faction within the Ravenna government seized absolute control. They viewed the Allied troops not as the Empire's shield, but as a latent infection requiring immediate, ruthless excision. Orders, both implicit and official, rapidly filtered down from the swamps of Ravenna to the regular Roman garrisons stationed across the Italian municipalities. What followed was a synchronized cascade of tactical suicide. Roman infantry turned their weapons away from the undefended frontiers and directed them inward, initiating a coordinated massacre against the families of the Gothic soldiers legally quartered within their cities. Wives and children were slaughtered in the provincial streets, their homes ransacked, and their property summarily seized by the state. The sheer logistical absurdity of this operation remains staggering. In a desperate blind bid to reassert ideological supremacy, the isolated government annihilated the only diplomatic leverage guaranteeing the loyalty of their most lethal field armies, fundamentally betraying the exact men currently standing the watch. The backlash was instantaneous, disciplined, and catastrophic. As word of the slaughter reached the outer encampments, it transformed a frustrated Allied force into a highly organized apparatus of vengeance. 30,000 elite Gothic veterans, men intimately trained in Roman tactical doctrine, hardened by decades of frontier warfare, and equipped with state-issued chainmail and heavy iron swords, simultaneously abandoned their posts. The marching rhythm of tens of thousands of heavy infantry pivoting southward generated a relentless, terrifying pressure. Columns of dust marked the major highways as this massive host advanced, their formation tight, presenting a unified, impenetrable wall of interlocking shields. They did not devolve into a disorganized, looting mob. They consolidated directly under Alaric's command, moving with the cold, mechanical precision of a regular army preparing for a siege. The strategic reality of the peninsula reversed overnight, leaving the capital entirely devoid of a capable intercepting force. When the exhausted dispatch riders finally arrived bearing reports of the mass defection, a deafening, paralyzed silence fell over the marble halls of the Senate. Into the assembled magistrates sat completely frozen as they calculated the brutal mathematics of their impending doom. 30,000 of the Empire's absolute best soldiers had just turned their spears inward, marching not as disorganized rebels, but as grieving, professional executioners. The entire forward defense grid had simply evaporated. Alaric now possessed a massive, vengeful army inside Italy. But he didn't initially want to destroy Rome. He wanted something far more dangerous. Alaric was not the archetypal savage king, driven by a blind desire to reduce civilization to ash. He was intimately familiar with Roman military doctrine, a calculating pragmatist who had spent much of his adult life fighting beneath the imperial eagles. Decades earlier, under Emperor Theodosius, Gothic auxiliaries had absorbed horrific casualties defending Roman interests, a sacrifice that Alaric believed had earned his people a permanent, recognized place within the societal hierarchy. His ultimate objective was never the annihilation of the state. It was structural integration. He demanded the official rank of Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers, and legally recognized agricultural tracts in the provinces of Noricum or Pannonia. His campaign was fundamentally a desperate logistical maneuver to secure arable land and a reliable food supply for a displaced people seeking legitimacy within the vast bureaucratic framework of the very empire he now threatened. For months, Alaric held his heavy infantry in check, keeping his forces stationed just outside the major population centers. He actively sought a bloodless resolution, while repeatedly dispatching envoys to Ravenna. He offered to pledge his 30,000 veterans as a loyal, permanent defensive force to secure the porous northern borders in exchange for grain shipments and territorial rights. Yet, Honorius and his isolated ministers consistently chose arrogance over survival. Ensconced within their impenetrable marshes, the imperial court repeatedly stalled, broke preliminary treaties, and issued insulting decrees. They operated under the fatally flawed assumption that a Germanic commander lacked the administrative infrastructure and logistical endurance required to maintain a prolonged military campaign on Italian soil. This was a profound misjudgment of Alaric's tactical patience and the iron discipline he exerted over his ranks. As the diplomatic avenues steadily collapsed, the tactical pressure around the ancient capital escalated to a breaking point. Just beyond the massive Aurelian walls, the sprawling Visigothic encampment functioned with the terrifying organized efficiency of a regular legion. The grating, rhythmic metallic rasp of thousands of iron swords being methodically sharpened against whetstones carried over the stone battlements day and night. A constant, abrasive psychological assault on the defenders within. The wind shifting off the Tiber carried the sharp utilitarian tang of pinewood smoke and heavily oiled leather, the unmistakable scent of a professional army preparing not for a chaotic, undisciplined raid, but for a systematic, protracted operation. The emperor's endless betrayals and refusal to honor basic agreements finally extinguished any remaining prospect of a negotiated settlement. Alaric clearly understood that Honorius, safely insulated in the north, felt no immediate physical danger from the Gothic presence. To fundamentally alter the political calculus and compel the imperial government to yield, the pressure had to be applied directly to the empire's economic and psychological heart. When diplomacy failed for the final time, Alaric realized the only way to force the emperor's hand was to strangle his most prized possession. The physical fortifications of Rome, the towering Aurelian walls, remained structurally pristine and formidable. They were an engineering marvel designed to repel massive, sustained assaults, and technically, they had not failed. However, military architecture is entirely useless when the men manning the battlements reach the absolute limits of physiological and psychological endurance. By the night of August 24th, 410 CE, the defensive perimeter did not succumb to a battery of iron-headed siege rams or a concerted escalade. The walls held perfectly. The society within them simply broke. The historical record remains fractured regarding the precise catalyst, whether it was a coordinated uprising of rebellious slaves seizing a fleeting chance at liberation, or merely starving, desperate Roman citizens deciding that the swift terror of a Gothic occupation was vastly preferable to the agonizing certainty of famine. Regardless of the internal machinations, the decisive failure manifested at the Porta Salaria, the heavily fortified northeastern gate. In the deep, disorienting darkness of the midnight watch, the massive iron-studded timber doors swung inward, their heavy bronze bolts quietly drawn back by unseen hands from the inside. There was no preceding artillery barrage, no frantic struggle along the parapets. The transition from a protracted blockade to a catastrophic breach occurred in an instant of terrifying silence. That silence was immediately obliterated by a sound the interior of the ancient capital had not experienced in 800 years. The sudden gut-wrenching blast of Gothic animal horn trumpets shattered the humid night, bouncing off the marble facades of the nearby patrician villas, originating entirely inside the city limits. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in tactical confusion. The few remaining urban cohorts, severely compromised by months of half rations, that were utterly incapable of organizing a coherent defensive line. In the narrow, winding streets of the Subura, The darkness magnified the chaos. Frantic, shouted commands in clipped Latin were quickly drowned out by the harsh, guttural roar of Germanic orders echoing down the wide avenues. The ground itself began to vibrate under the relentless, synchronized marching rhythm of heavy infantry surging continuously through the bottleneck of the Salarian gate. The deafening metallic crash of heavy wooden shields, violently colliding with hasty civilian-built barricades, announced the vanguard's relentless advance. Thick dust, kicked up by tens of thousands of marching boots, rolled through the alleys, completely obscuring the systematic movements of a highly disciplined army now operating freely within a confined urban environment. Alaric's field commanders did not allow their men to break formation or devolve into an uncoordinated mob. They rapidly secured the primary thoroughfares, locking down the key intersections and neutralizing any isolated pockets of armed resistance with veteran precision and overwhelming tactical pressure. The psychological collapse of the Roman defenders was absolute. The sheer sight of hostile columns advancing past the sacred boundaries shattered their remaining will to fight. Centuries of perceived imperial invincibility dissolved in mere minutes under the crushing weight of this calculated military occupation. The gates were wide open, and tens of thousands of starving, angry soldiers poured into the richest city on earth. Contrary to the lurid exaggerations of later chroniclers, the occupation of the capital did not devolve into a mindless frenzy of slaughter. Alaric's forces were not a disorganized mob. They were a professional, highly disciplined army operating under a strict chain of command. The tactical pressure simply shifted from urban combat to systematic logistical extraction. This was a military apparatus collecting decades of unpaid wages directly from the imperial treasury. Officers directed regular cohorts through the patrician districts, methodically stripping the sprawling estates on the Aventine and Calian hills. The air grew dense with the dry, ancient dust of crushed masonry and shattered lockboxes as soldiers systematically broke into hidden vaults. Columns of infantry established secure perimeters around the major forums, efficiently cataloging and loading immense quantities of silver plate on Tyrian purple silk and unminted bullion onto requisition transport carts. The sheer scale of the wealth transfer required industrial-level coordination. Within the ancient center of the empire, the physical manifestations of Roman supremacy were dismantled piece by piece. The mausoleum of Augustus, the sacred resting place of the early emperors, was forced open, its gold-inlaid urns emptied, and the imperial ashes scattered across the travertine stones to extract the precious metals housing them. The heavy, resonant thud of imperial bronze statues being pulled from their pedestals and shattering on the marble floors of the forum provided a continuous, percussive rhythm to the operation. The smell of sweat and oiled leather permeated the once pristine political centers as Gothic work details hauled heavy loads of plunder past the desecrated temples. These monuments, the untouchable symbols of pagan antiquity, were efficiently broken down, their raw materials destined for the smelting fires. Yet, amidst this unprecedented confiscation of secular wealth, Alaric enforced a remarkable degree of religious restraint. The Visigoths, predominantly Arian Christians, operated under strict orders to respect the sanctity of the major Christian basilicas. The massive churches of St. Peter on the Vatican Hill and St. Paul outside the walls were immediately declared absolute zones of asylum. Gothic patrols actively escorted terrified citizens, both Christian and pagan, through the contested streets, depositing them safely within the cavernous naves of these sanctuaries. Inside, Roman patricians huddled alongside their former slaves, watching in stunned disbelief as armed Gothic guards stood watch at the bronze doors, turning away any soldier attempting to cross the threshold for plunder. This calculated restraint highlighted a profound shift in the cultural landscape. The old marble gods of the Republic were defenseless, while the institutions of the new faith were granted sovereign immunity by a conquering foreign army. The occupation lasted exactly 3 days, a highly abbreviated timeline for an army holding the most lucrative strategic asset in the Mediterranean. Alaric understood that his men could not remain statically garrisoned. The severed grain supply meant the city was rapidly becoming a sprawling, uninhabitable trap. By August 27th, the order to withdraw was given. The Gothic host filed out through the southern gates, taking with them an unprecedented accumulation of material wealth, alongside a carefully selected group of high-value political hostages. Among them was Galla Placidia, the half-sister of Emperor Honorius, seized to serve as the ultimate diplomatic leverage against the court at Ravenna. Alaric marched away with endless wagon trains of gold, but the true damage inflicted in those 3 days wasn't physical. It was ideological. When the relentless marching rhythm of the Visigothic rearguard finally faded beyond the southern horizon, it left behind a vacuum of tactical pressure. A desolate, sweeping wind began to blow through the silent, empty streets of the Palatine Hill, kicking up the pale dust of shattered marble and the lingering gray ash of the Celestian Gardens. The physical architecture largely remained intact, but the psychological foundation of the classical world had been fundamentally severed. The news of the sack radiated outward along the Imperial highway system like a seismic shockwave, paralyzing the distant provinces. In a fortified monastery in Bethlehem, the scholar Jerome wept openly upon receiving the dispatch, recording the defining lament of the era. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. For over 8 centuries, the central ideological pillar of the Roman state was the unquestioned concept of Roma Aeterna, the invincible, eternal city ordained to govern the earth. The breach of the Porta Salaria instantly evaporated that collective delusion. In the immediate aftermath, a profound existential crisis gripped the Mediterranean basin. Disillusioned pagan patricians vehemently argued that the disaster was a direct consequence of abandoning the ancient pantheon for the Christian cross. To counter this ideological threat, Augustine of Hippo composed his monumental treatise, The City of God. He systematically decoupled the spiritual survival of the new faith from the political survival of the Roman state, establishing a new theological paradigm that would construct the framework of Western European thought for the next 1,000 years. The sack of 410 CE did not technically erase the Western Roman Empire from the map on that very day. The bureaucratic machinery ground on, and a succession of increasingly irrelevant emperors continued to issue hollow decrees from the stagnant safety of the Ravenna marshes. But an empire does not truly collapse when its final monarch is deposed. It dies the exact moment its citizens stop believing in its permanence. The actual political dissolution in 476 CE, when the last Western emperor was quietly retired by a Germanic general, was merely an administrative formality acknowledging a reality sealed 66 years earlier. Alaric did not simply extract Rome's gold. He assassinated its aura of inevitability. The violation of the Eternal City serves as the ultimate historical masterclass in Imperial hubris. It proves definitively that no military fortification, no matter how meticulously engineered, can protect a government that betrays its own defenders, isolates itself from its populace, and relies on the illusions of past glory. History is entirely merciless to the stagnant. To continue dissecting the pivotal strategic decisions that forged our world, please subscribe to our channel to relive these heroic chapters of history with us.